It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the Dell Alienware AW3225QF. In the description of the video you'll find some accompanying resources alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. Be aware that liking the video, subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, they are nice ways of showing your support. As usual for a video review, what you see depends on my camera, depends on the processing done by my video editing software, depends on the processing done by YouTube, and ultimately, and very importantly, depends on the screen that you're viewing the video on, so it doesn't accurately represent what you'd see firsthand using the monitor. This monitor uses a 32-inch, or more specifically 31.6-inch QD OLED panel from Samsung Display. This has a 3840 by 2160, that's 4K UHD resolution, and it also has a 1700R curve to the screen when you're sitting in front of the monitor using it normally and you've used it for any appreciable length of time. I've used this monitor for a few weeks now, and I would say that I barely notice the curve now, even when I'm on the desktop, so that's to say I don't find it bothersome in any way. I'd say it adds a subtle sense of extra depth when I'm gaming, when I'm watching videos, but it doesn't draw you in the same way as a steeper curve might. At the same token, a steeper curve, let's say 1000R on a 32-inch model like this, I find that too steep. I can accept it on ultra-wides, but on 32-inch models like this, 1000R curve, it's just too much, and I do find it annoying on the desktop. So with this one, the 1700R curve, it doesn't have the same issue. So it is something which I think most people will adapt to and find natural, given a little bit of time, although I still appreciate that some people do prefer the geometric perfection and predictability of a flat screen. So with a 4K UHD resolution spread out across a screen of this size, I can happily use it without any scaling, although you may want to use a bit of scaling. So without scaling, I get a huge amount of desktop real estate. The clarity and sharpness of text, and I will cover this in a little bit more detail shortly, is excellent. The same with suitably high resolution image content. There's a nice crisp look, a definite 4K look to things. And although the text looks very small there, it's very readable, it's nice and sharp because of the excellent pixel density. So it's really very good indeed in terms of the desktop real estate potential. There's an article linked to in the description of the video which looks at the 4K UHD resolution in a bit more detail. It's from the perspective of a 27 or 28-inch screen, but a lot of that really does apply to the larger 31.6-inch screen of this model. So I'm going to explore the refresh rate support of this monitor a little bit more and some of the capabilities related to that. So it has 3840 by 2160 at up to 240 Hz, and at the same time it supports up to 10 bits per channel color support. You've got HDR, high dynamic range at the same time if you want, and VRR, variable refresh rate technologies such as AMD FreeSync or NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode. If you're using HDMI 2.1, you also get up to 240 Hz with these features I've just mentioned, and you can get up to 12 bits per channel. Don't rush out to use HDMI 2.1 over DisplayPort just so you can get 12 bits per channel. For the vast majority of content, it makes absolutely no difference what you select here, because under SDR, most content is 8-bit, and sometimes 10-bit if you're specifically editing with a 10-bit workflow. And for HDR, that's generally 10-bit, which is where HDR10 gets its name from. So don't think that just because you select a higher bit depth here in the graphics driver that it's going to give you any particular advantage. But just be aware it is supported if you can make use of the higher bit depth. And there are some additional refresh rates listed, some lower refresh rates, as you can see here. And this is for DisplayPort, same for HDMI. So for those interested, the HDMI 2.1 ports of this monitor, they are full bandwidth 48 gigabits per second ports. So they're not cut down HDMI 2.1 ports, in other words. I'm just going to talk briefly about scaling on this monitor. It does support an interpolation processor scaling process for resolutions such as 2560 by 1440 QHD and 1920 by 1080 Full HD. So you can see it's listing there. The resolution is 2560 by 1440, 240 Hz. Now, I won't be able to see in the video how it actually would look to the eye, but I still just wanted to talk briefly about it. So there is a sharpness control on this monitor. Without using that, with just using neutral sharpness, so that's set to 50, which is the default, things do look a bit on the soft side, softer than they should on the 32-inch model with this resolution. But that's because it is not the native resolution of the monitor. You can increase the sharpness in display. I'd say 70% works pretty well, but it's quite subjective. And this does offset the softening a bit. I'd say if you go higher than this, it starts to look a bit over-sharpened. The overall balance, I'd say, is okay, actually, with the sharpness at 70 as far as interpolation goes on monitors of this size and resolution. So it is quite usable if you have to use the 2560 by 1440 resolution. For the full HD resolution, you have to be running at 120 Hz or below. At 240 Hz, it doesn't actually support scaling on the monitor. Just trying to use GPU scaling here. If I select 120 Hz though, it should scale properly. Here we are. And I'd say the softening is more noticeable for the full HD resolution, although the full HD resolution on a screen of this size never looks amazing anyway. That's even with the sharpness at 70%, by the way. You might want to increase this a little bit to 80%, perhaps even 90%, depending on your own preferences. So in conclusion, reasonable interpolation or scaling performance by this monitor for non-native resolutions. I'm now going to focus on the external features of the monitor. So the monitor has your usual Alienware styling. So this one is the lunar light coloration. So it is a mixture of matte black plastic with some, actually technically a very light grey, or you might say a very slight silverish colour, but really it looks white in most lighting, which tops the stand base, and it's also found at the back when I show you that. The stand offers decent ergonomic flexibility. You can swivel the screen left and right, you can tilt it backwards and forwards a little bit, and you can adjust the height. The height adjustment's 110mm or 4.33 inches, so it's not a huge amount of height adjustment, but just to give you an idea of that. The lowest stand height, it's reasonably close to the desk, and that's the maximum stand height. Enough for most people, but if you're particularly tall, and it depends on your desk height as well, then you might want to consider a different mount than the included stand. As usual for an Alienware monitor, the adjustments are pretty smooth really, they're not too grabby. And I'm going to talk about the screen surface. So I'm in a fairly bright room at the moment, that is to say there is a bit of natural daylight. There's also some artificial lighting in the room, that's just to make sure you can see that this is, yes, it's a glossy screen surface, and it has an anti-reflective treatment. The anti-reflective treatment is actually very effective. I've noted this in previous QD OLED reviews I've done. This treatment is similar to other QD OLEDs. You might notice there's a bit of a colour to the white wall there that's illuminated, and that isn't because I've got a colourful light. I do actually have a light there shining onto the wall, but that is white light. It's just to show you that the screen can take on a bit of a colour if you're sitting in a bright room and there's a bit of strong light striking the screen. Again, this is typical for QD OLED monitors. If the screen is on and you're viewing dark content, you can also notice this, and it sort of the general lightening up of blacks or very dark shades. But I'm going to explore this more in the contrast section. And as I explore there, it doesn't mean you have to sit in a pitch black room, so don't worry about that. You might also notice that the reflections are stretched out quite a bit, but that's not a mirror-like reflection. Many glossy screen surfaces, if they don't have a particularly effective anti-reflective treatment, they'd really have more of a mirror-like appearance here. There'd be much clearer details on everything that's reflected. But yeah, stretched out reflections, and that becomes more noticeable if you view the screen off angle. And then you can pick up some potentially much sharper reflections as well. As is common for a modern monitor, dual stage bezel design, that means there is a black panel border flush with the rest of the screen. And actually, if you compare the black of the panel border to the colourful elements, that's how you can see that there is lighting up and there is some of that magenta, sometimes it can be a brown depending on the lighting, kind of tint to the image, or you might describe it as pink, up to you, very subjective and does depend on the lighting. But again, these aren't ideal conditions. I've picked these so that you can actually see the screen surface in all its glory, so to speak. Sorry, I got a bit sidetracked there. And the outside of the bezel, that's a slim, hard plastic outer component. There's also an active area around the image, as usual for QD OLED. So the image will actually bounce around within this. It's a pixel shift kind of feature. It's just one of the image retention mitigation measures that this monitor uses. You can't disable that measure in this case. It's always on. But the image does not run off the screen. You can always see the entire image. It's just that it bounces around in that active area, which is an over-provisioning of pixels. I've now turned my room lights off. There is natural light coming in from the left and the right. It isn't a bright day though. It's not particularly bright in this room, but it's certainly far from pitch black. I'd describe it as moderately bright. And from a normal viewing position, you can see that the coloration to the screen has reduced. There's still a bit of that going on. I do have a white wall behind me, and with light shining on that from outside. But if you've got light striking the screen directly from behind you, or you're in a particularly bright room, then you certainly will notice more of that brightening up like I showed you before. But the reflection handling in this sort of moderate brightness is pretty good. And remember that with matte screen surfaces, you're going to be seeing glare patches in these kind of conditions as well. The light is diffused across the screen. From the rear, you can see the lunar light coloration continuing, the mixture of white-ish colour and black, or you might call it dark grey in places. But anyway, a monochromatic theme, I like to call it. The stand, it is plastic, but it's also weighted internally with metal. It's got a nice sort of heft to it, and it is solid. It does feel solid. It gives a solid overall feel to the monitor. Yes, I am a fan of metal generally, but as far as plastic stands go, this is really one of the better ones. I would say that the overall build quality extends to the rest of the monitor as well. It just feels solid and well put together. A nice premium product in that respect. You can see though that the stand is pretty deep. According to my super quick and very rough measurements, it's around 300mm or 1 foot deep. And the screen sits pretty close to the front edge of the stand, perhaps 3 inches, 8 centimeters or so back from the front edge of the stand if you look at the center of the screen. But remember, it's curved, so the edges of the screen will be a little bit closer than that. But you can detach the included stand if you need to, using this little button there. Don't want to press that right now for obvious reasons. And that will reveal provision for 100 by 100mm VESA mounting. A few other areas of note from the rear, the little alien head there and 32. They're illuminated, they're alien effects lighting features, the other one being the power button, which you can see there would be at the bottom right underneath the bottom bezel as viewed from the front. To reveal the port, you can remove this port cover. It's just there to neaten things up. You see it has a central area for feeding the cables through. The ports face downwards. You'll find an AC power input, so the monitor has an internal power converter. There's then a USB Type-B upstream port plus 2 USB 3.2 Gen 1 downstream ports, 2 HDMI 2.1 ports. These are full bandwidth 48 gigabits per second, and the first port there supports eARC or ARC, so audio return channel, if you're using a soundbar, that kind of thing. And there's a DisplayPort 1.4 input with DSC. A few additional ports at the bottom for easy access. We got another USB 3.2 Gen 1 port, in addition to a USB-C port. And that offers downstream capability. It isn't an upstream port, and it offers 15 watts of power delivery. And I'm going to talk a bit about the subpixels of the monitor. So this image here, it shows the first gen QD OLED, so that was the 34-inch 3440 by 1440 ultra wides. It shows the subpixel layout of those ones. The second gen QD OLED, so that has the same pixel density because that's a 49-inch 5120 by 1440, same pixel density as the 34-inch models, but they changed the subpixel shape, so it's a bit more square, but you can see that in both cases it has this sort of triangle layout, so it is RGB, red, green, then blue, but there's a displacement of the green above the red and the blue. So this is a so-called triangle layout or triad design for the subpixels. And you can see at the bottom there, the third generation high DPI QD OLED, that's the panel used here. So that maintains the more squared design of the second gen QD OLED, but it also increases the pixel density significantly. So what does all this mean? Well, there are issues with fringing to be aware of on QD OLEDs, and the issue is explored in an article on the website, which is linked to in the description of the video, but the issue really was more prominent on the first gen QD OLEDs, and then when they changed to the more squared design for the subpixels, that made the fringing a lot thinner. That's for the second generation QD OLEDs, but it was still there, and sensitive users could potentially still find it bothersome on the second gens. But this third generation, combining that with a much tighter pixel density, it's now reached a level where the fringing is so slim that it really is difficult to spot, even if you're specifically looking for it. There are some instances where you can notice it, especially if you're pixel peeping, so to speak. You're looking very closely at the screen. You can see a little bit of the colourful fringing around these high contrast elements like the table of contents here. So that's black with a white background, and you've got white text as well in the middle. So this is a bit of a sort of torture test for fringing. It will show QD OLED fringing, but I would like to stress that it is super thin. It's so thin, in fact, that I've decided not to show you any pictures zoomed in showing the fringing, because it really massively exaggerates the issue. I just have to stress that to the eye, the vast majority of people are either not going to notice it or are not going to find it bothersome at all. So even if you've got this running side by side with a normal RGB layout, IPS LCD, for example, of the same pixel density, you're not going to look at this QD OLED and think, oh, this fringing's horrible, it just doesn't look as sharp. it really is a slight difference. And I'm sorry that I can't give you a better idea of how it looks to the eye. It really is something you'd have to see in person, but I'm just going to leave it as it's really going to be a non-issue for the vast majority of people. I'm now going to explore the calibration of the monitor. So this table here shows a few different conditions, and it shows the gamma and white point measured using a Spider X Elite colorimeter. So out of the box with the standard factory default setting, good 2.2 gamma tracking and a good white point 6471K without a particular green push. That means there's a good balanced neutral green channel, which I like to see. There are some creator settings, so you can set the color space to DCI-P3, and I will explore this a little bit later in the review in the color reproduction section. And if you do that, there is a green push. That's really part of the DCI-P3 standard. If you're strictly following that, it does have a bit of a green push to it for the white point. With sRGB, there wasn't this green push, and there was just a nice balance overall. And again, I'll explore this in more detail shortly. I also like to look just a little bit at any low blue light settings the monitor might have, or perhaps the strongest low blue light setting if that's applicable. So in this case, there is a setting called warm, and that's a low blue light setting which gives a slightly warmer look to things, the 5900K, but that's not particularly warm and it's not an effective low blue light setting. So you might want to just create your own low blue light setting by modifying the color channels. And on this monitor, there's quite a lot of flexibility with the presets. So you could save that to game 1, game 2, game 3, and then you can quickly access that with the shortcut keys. And then with the changes made to my test settings, this isn't a typo. I did actually manage to get 6500K on the dot when I recorded it, and a 2.2 gamma. The monitor does include a factory calibration report, and this is for the sRGB and DCI-P3 creator mode presets, and it promises a delta E equal to or below 2, and in my case it does show an average delta E easily below 2 for both settings, but definitely for sRGB. And this is the second page of the calibration report. Now, interestingly, DCI-P3 should really be tracking 2.6 gamma if you're strictly going by the standard, but you can change the gamma setting. And I believe it was with a firmware update, they actually seemed to change the default setting to 2.2, or it was on my unit anyway. But you can just change that setting if you want. However, be aware again, like I said, it does have a bit of a green tint and you can't actually change the color channels when you are using the creator settings. It's a strange restriction to have, but I've noticed it on Alienware monitors before with the creator settings. Don't know why they do that, but they've decided to do that. And just at the bottom of the report here, there's just some uniformity data, just to show brightness uniformity and color uniformity measurements at different points of the display. So I'm just going to look at the gamma in a little bit more detail. So this graph here shows the gamma under my test settings. Good 2.2 tracking, and this is very similar to the factory defaults, by the way. Gamma changes just a little bit with brightness adjustment, so it's not really worth exploring that in more depth. This is very different to some OLED monitors which show more pronounced gamma changes with brightness adjustment, such as the AW3225QF. This graph here shows the gamma using the sRGB setting, so creator mode equals sRGB. Again, very good overall 2.2 tracking, but there is some deviation in places, most noticeably for some medium shades, around an input RGB of 35 to 55% on this graph. So those shades are just a bit deeper than they should be. But again, not huge deviations here. I also like to explore the color accuracy just a little bit with any sRGB settings that monitors might have. So creator mode sRGB in this case, and overall very strong performance. Actually, the average delta E 1.02 with this Spider Checker 24 test pattern. The obvious outlier here, as it often is shade 1F, cerulean. It's a pesky shade. Very slight changes in green versus blue balance can just throw off the accuracy here. And OLED monitors in particular are quite prone to this, although I've seen this on many LCDs as well. Just OLEDs seem to be struggling just a little bit more with this shade, but it's a very specific shade, and I wouldn't worry too much about this. I think it's always the highest error for this particular test patch. Still, overall, a strong sRGB color accuracy performance here. And just to quickly revisit this table, because I didn't really mention my test settings, they are given here, and there is a best settings video which explores these in more detail and justifies them a bit, so to speak. And also just a little note at the end of the table there are some ICC profiles that you'll find in the description of the review, one created using the test settings and the other using creator color space sRGB, with everything at the defaults for that setting. Moving on now to the contrast and brightness performance of the monitor. So the values in this table, they were taken using an X-Rite i1 Display Pro Plus, which would now be marketed as a Calibrite Color Checker Display Plus. And for this test, there is a white square in the center of the screen, and that's surrounded by various shades, so really desktop backgrounds, various different desktop backgrounds I like to use here. The black measurements would be a black square, but in this case you don't have to worry about the black luminance. It's always recorded as 0.00 because it's an OLED, so the pixels are shutting off completely. They're able to do that. So in this test you get an infinite contrast ratio. But the white luminance values, you can certainly have a look at them and you'll see there's a range, and the reason that there's a range is because as the desktop background changes and the shade levels shown on the screen change, OLEDs like this, they do have a bit of an ABL, automatic brightness limiter behavior. Although in this case, it's what some people may refer to as a logo detection feature, although it actually affects the whole screen rather than just specific areas. Whatever you want to call it though, it's minimized using the creator preset, which is why you'll see a lower range for the recordings on the table here using the creator presets. And that's the case whether using sRGB or DCI-P3, although DCI-P3 shows the lowest range, or did in my testing. But either way, it's lower than using the standard preset. Outside of this, though, if you are using the standard preset, for example, the fluctuations aren't as obvious by eye as you might think from the recorded figures. So most of the time, this is for a wide range of shade combinations, the monitor stays towards the lower end of the brightness range. Brightness at the upper end of the range is observed if the vast majority of the screen contains white or very bright shades, or black or very dark shades. So it isn't constantly fluctuating on the desktop as you scroll on applications and you shift windows around, etc., like a traditional aggressive ABL might. So basically, it's not actually that annoying. It's not as annoying as you might think when you look at the figures. You think there's quite a lot of fluctuation, 212 to 258, for example, at maximum brightness using the standard preset. It appears its aim is to reduce the chance of image retention where mixed content is present, and that could potentially be static, for example, on the desktop. But it doesn't actually require that the content is static. It'll also apply to dynamic mixed content. So yeah, I didn't find it annoying regardless of the usage, unlike traditional aggressive ABL, but I would have still preferred to see an option to disable it, and it does mean you can only really claim this monitor is at around 250 nits for SDR if you're using the creator preset or specific content is being displayed outside of that. So before you fall asleep, I'll show you some gameplay. I'm on Shadow of the Tomb Raider. I'm going to talk about the contrast performance using some in-game examples. So as an OLED, the monitor has excellent precision over the brightness levels of its pixels, so it can have some nice and bright, whilst others right next to it can be extremely dark. Basically, they can be shut off or close to it depending on the shade which is demanded. And with this per pixel illumination, the monitor is able to achieve exceptional atmosphere and depth to the darker shades. It's able to give really nice depth to the medium dark shades as well, and bright shades can be shown with appropriate brightness as well. And all of this can be on the screen at the same time. So it is certainly a look which I appreciate, and you can also appreciate that there's no IPS glow or VA glow or any type of glow to impede things, and the gamma consistency is exceptional. So that is to say that the detail levels are maintained very well throughout the screen. There's no shifts vertically or horizontally comparing the center to the edges as you would get on various LCD panel types. I know people like to talk a little bit about black crush when they talk about OLEDs, but I don't really like to use the term black crush. I think it's a bit too strong for terminology, because the 2.2 gamma tracking of this is actually very good, and the 2.2 gamma curve doesn't demand that there is a lot of elevation for dark shades. Usually when people think about black crush, certainly in the LCD realm, they'll be thinking of VA models where there's a cone in the center of the screen where things really are clearly crushed together. Then peripherally there'll be an excessive amount of detail. So perceived gamma is basically far too high for the darker shades centrally and a bit too low peripherally, leading to this sort of differential detail level and also black crush centrally. There's really nothing like that here. Really, the overall dark detail levels are beyond what you would see on any LCD. And again, that consistency is really nice. But be aware, I'm talking about these little nuances and I'm observing in a very dark room. There is a little bit of light behind the monitor. That's just from the Alien Effects lighting feature, which I left on. It's set to red, so there's just a very slight red glow behind the screen, but that certainly isn't striking or interacting with the screen surface. I've now let some light into the room. It's not a super bright day, but there is a bit of natural daylight striking the screen surface and just ambient daylight in the room now. So you can't really appreciate the depth of the dark shades as much. And as I mentioned with respect to the screen surface before, yes, it does lighten up a bit in these somewhat brighter conditions, although again this isn't particularly bright, so it actually does maintain quite good depth for the darker shades even in these conditions. So you don't have to be sitting in a complete cave to enjoy the OLED experience here, but you do want to be mindful of the screen surface and try and reduce the amount of direct light striking the screen surface directly, and also avoid just sitting in a very bright room in general. But yes, as the room gets brighter, the edge versus LCDs diminishes. It's really in the darker environments where you can appreciate the stronger contrast of this OLED monitor. For the bright shades, the screen surface certainly has its benefits. So there's no layering in front of the image, there's no graininess, there's no matte surface used here. It is a glossy surface with an anti-reflective finish. So if, like me, you're sensitive to matte screen surfaces, then this can certainly be a very nice thing. As you might have picked up, I do have quite good control of my lighting in this room, so I can certainly make good use of this screen surface, and I do actually like it overall, but you do have to be mindful of those things I've mentioned with respect to your lighting environment. And I'm going to talk about the colour reproduction of the monitor, and to start off I like to use lagom.nl, the test for viewing angles, and talk a little bit about colour consistency. So that is to say how a shade appears centrally versus any other point of the screen. So the lagom text, that appears consistent with a slight red striping throughout. That indicates a low viewing angle dependency to the gamma curve of the monitor, as you'd expect from an OLED. The purple block appears a slightly pinkish purple throughout the screen. It's nice and consistent. It may not appear that way in the video, but for some reason this shade often appears odd in the video, but it's nice and consistent to the eye. The red block, that appears a good rich red throughout the screen, also very consistent. Even on IPS models, you will sometimes see a sort of vignetting effect, or at least a bit of darkening of this shade towards the edges, but that doesn't happen here. The consistency is exceptional. On VA models, you'll tend to have a more saturated area centrally, sort of in the cone of the screen, then it'll become less saturated further out. None of that happening here. The green block appears very consistent, saturated green chartreuse throughout the screen. The blue block appears a good royal blue throughout the screen. I'm on Battlefield 2042 now, and I'm going to talk about colour reproduction using some in-game examples. So that excellent colour consistency, which I showed you with lagom, that's something which you observe when you're using the monitor more broadly, including when you're gaming. So the representation of a given shade, the levels of saturation of this grass, for example, maintained beautifully well throughout the screen. Also, if you happen to be viewing off angle, the monitor looks very much like a picture. I mean, any shifts you see in the video, they'll be down to the camera compensating in various ways. But to the eye, the viewing angle performance is exceptional, beyond what you get on even the strongest LCD performers. Now, most content you consume, and that includes this game, which is running under SDR, it's designed with the sRGB colour space in mind. And if you're observing this with a gamut on the monitor that is wider than sRGB, then that invites extra vibrancy and extra saturation. So the native gamut of this monitor, I recorded 99% DCI-P3 coverage. That's a generous gamut. And if you're interested, 94% Adobe RGB. So there is some extension beyond DCI-P3 in some regions. So that gives things a vibrant look with extra saturation, and some elements are more saturated than the developers intend. So the sky blues there have a lot of pop. You might say they look a bit cartoonish, but they're certainly eye-catching. And some of these green shades as well. They don't actually look as neon as they do on some models with even more generous Adobe RGB coverage than this, but they certainly have a lot of pop to them, and yellowish greens stand out a bit too much. And some green shades just look overly bright. And the generous gamut in the red region as well brings out some earthy browns in a way that makes them look a bit too red. So any sort of natural red tints that you might see in various shades are brought out more strongly. That will include skin tones as well. They can look a bit reddish, although not to an extreme degree, not like they're completely sunburnt or anything like that. The lovely fire over there as well. That has some rather intense reds and some very rich reddish oranges. Yellows which verge on orange, and some of the oranges verging on red because of the oversaturation. But certainly a vibrant look which some will very much like. If you don't want that and you want things to look more as the developers intend, more toned down, closer to the sRGB standard. And you can switch over to the creator mode sRGB setting, and that does tone things down, so the sky blue looks more neutral now. The flames, the fires for the missiles there in the background, and also the flames here, they're toned down as well. The greens are less eye-catching and more muted. And as I explored earlier, this is a good sRGB emulation setting in terms of accuracy and gamma handling. You can also adjust the brightness to your liking. And there are different gamma settings associated with it if you want to change that. So there's 2.2, which is the default, and varies from 1.8 to 2.6. However, you can't change the color channels in this setting. And as for the color gamut, using this setting, I've recorded 100% sRGB coverage. There is a little bit of extension beyond that, but only a little bit really, only slivers and places. And it's certainly cut down massively compared to the native gamut. There's also a DCI-P3 setting. So in the creator preset, you change the color space to DCI-P3. Again, you can change the gamma. There are various different gamma settings. I'm using 2.2 at the moment. But again, you can't change the color channels, and there is a noticeable green tint. And you'll probably be able to pick that up even in the video. Well, I certainly can to the eye anyway. Things really look rather greenish. As I mentioned before, that is intended with the DCI-P3 standard, but it really is a flexibility which I would have preferred that they gave you, because I know some people just like to use the DCI-P3 gamut, either for creative purposes or just simply viewing content, because they like the saturation levels to be curtailed a bit without going as far as sRGB. So you don't necessarily want a green tint at the same time as all of that. So it's a bit of an annoying restriction, to be honest. But then again, most monitors don't actually have a DCI-P3 setting, so I shouldn't really hold it against the monitor too much. And with this setting, I recorded 96% DCI-P3, so that's down from the native 99%. There's a bit less coverage of the DCI-P3 space, although there is very little extension beyond DCI-P3 now, so it does cut it down quite effectively in that respect. Just back to my test settings now, just to round off this section. So yes, you might want to use one of the creator settings for creative purposes, but if you want the best results and the best flexibility, including color channel adjustments, you'd really want to be using the native gamut, and you'd want to be calibrating the monitor with a colorimeter or similar device of your own that will allow accurate gamut measurements and gamut mapping and various other corrections to apply which are specific to your unit. But if you want to use sort of vague gamut mapping and other corrections in the ICC profiles, there are some in the description of the video which you may wish to use, so do have a play with them if you want. The monitor certainly does offer good potential for accurate work within the DCI-P3 space with 99% DCI-P3 coverage. You get 100% sRGB coverage, of course, and I recorded 94% Adobe RGB, so it's decent within the Adobe RGB space. It's really quite flexible in terms of its color space potential, and of course you get that exceptional consistency which I mentioned before, which is really nice to maintain color accuracy throughout the screen, not just in the little central region that the colorimeter might be measuring. I'm now on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, but in the game under HDR. The monitor does indeed support HDR. It responds to two HDR formats. You've got HDR10 support and Dolby Vision support. I will be covering mainly HDR10. Dolby Vision is not supported to the same extent as HDR10, but I will be covering both a little bit. The monitor has VESA Display HDR True Black 400 certification, so that's an OLED standard, not to be confused with VESA Display HDR 400 without the True Black. The monitor also does support higher bursts of brightness if you're using an alternative HDR mode. So under HDR, as I explored in the best settings video, it's really HDR Peak 1000 that most people are going to be interested in. That will give you the full brightness capabilities. Dolby Vision, I would recommend leaving that off unless you're specifically looking at Dolby Vision content. Again, I will explore this shortly. But you can see there are various other smart HDR settings. And again, I explore these a bit more in the best settings video. You may also like the Display HDR True Black setting if you prefer a more toned down look to things with lower brightness levels, but you still want to enjoy the other attributes of HDR. So speaking of brightness, because this is an OLED and again the contrast measurements will be 0 black level and an infinite contrast recorded, there's no need to focus on anything other than brightness, so I'm just going to jump straight into the graphs here. This graph here shows an HDR brightness test with various different patch sizes. There's 1%, 4%, 9%, 25%, 49% and 100%. So there's a white patch in the middle of the screen, and the test runs in HDR, the monitor's in HDR, and the rest of the screen is pure black. And of course, for the 100% reading, the entire screen is white, there's no black visible, and that's a sustained reading taken after 30 seconds of the shade being displayed, whereas for the other patch sizes, they are what I call true peak readings, so the highest level that the monitor attains when that patch is being displayed on the screen. So the orange line there shows the Dell Alienware AW3225QF, so the first generation QD OLED, but this is a very typical QD OLED performance, so it's good to benchmark against, so to speak. The purple line here is with the HDR Peak 1000 setting on this monitor, the AW3225QF. You'll see it's actually really quite close to the orange line. It's actually a little bit dimmer, my sample was at least, but there can be some inter-unit variation and it's really nothing to stress about. The difference here is slight, and to be honest, if I hadn't measured it, I wouldn't have even known there was a difference. So to the eye, it's not something which you're going to readily pick up on. The grey line there, that is using the Display HDR True Black setting. So you can see it's a lot more consistent there, but it reaches a lower brightness. So the typical QD OLED performance parameters under HDR apply, so there is ABL, automatic brightness limiter behavior, so it reaches its peak with the 1% window in this test. So basically it can show really nice brightness for small highlights, but as bright shades dominate, or in this test as the white patch becomes larger, then the brightness capability is diminished. The brightness that can be attained, I should say, is diminished. So there's quite a drop off by the 9% patch size. So the luminance is roughly half of what it is at peak for smaller patch sizes. Then it drops further to 364, then 312, and then it drops down to 251 nits for 100% sustained. This graph is a little bit different. So the true black reading has gone bye-bye, and instead I've replaced it with another line which shows the Dolby Vision bright setting. But this is an HDR10 test, it's not a Dolby Vision test, so this isn't a true reflection of what you can expect with Dolby Vision itself. It is a little bit brighter than with the HDR Peak 1000 setting, but really only a little bit. I just wanted to include it here just for completeness, really, just to show you that you can get a little bit of extra brightness, but this tells you nothing about the calibration of the display and what you can actually expect in practice, which I will cover subjectively very shortly. So back to the game and what this all means. Well, you've got the per pixel illumination still, so the dark elements there are really nice and dark, so the little shadowy details in the rock cracks there, very dark indeed. The medium to dark shades very slightly brighter, and the bright to medium shades brighter again. So basically you've got an exceptional array of different brightness levels with per pixel illumination showing this all appropriately. You've also got 10-bit color reproduction, which helps improve the nuanced shade variety. It can also help smooth out gradients, but that doesn't apply in this particular scene. But it does for the brighter shades, which I'll show you a bit later. It allows gentler gradients, smoother shade progressions, and just a more natural look to things. But in this scene, it really does allow the monitor to display the little shadowy details with beautiful depth. The medium shades are shown with really nice depth as well. They don't look flooded or washed out as they typically would on LCDs. And at the same time, the bright shades here are shown with very nice eye-catching brightness. So yes, the dimming precision here is exceptional. It's basically like having 8.3 million dimming zones or so. So absolutely fantastic in that respect. I'm now going to dive into the water and consider some brighter shades. I like this scene for showing HDR off on monitors and just testing it. It's a scene I'm extremely familiar with, so I do like to use it. But the darker shades there shown very nicely. Again, the variety of medium and darker shades, very impressive. The burst of light up there, really nice smooth gradients as well, and a nice sort of natural look to the brightness. The glint of light on the water surface as well, very eye-catching indeed. I actually measured 1010 nits maximum for this particular element, so that's very impressive indeed. It's basically the maximum the monitor can output. Although I also recorded a minimum of 720 nits, and what I mean by that is you'll see it pulses to various different sizes. When it pulses to become particularly large, the ABL actually kicks in a little bit, which is why it was down to perhaps 720 minimum. But most of the time, it's closer to the maximum than it is to the minimum. And either way, it's eye-catching and it's bright. And also, unlike WOLEDs, which use a white pixel to show their brightness, and that's used very heavily under HDR. Remember that this has RGB subpixels, so you don't have unfiltered white light coming from the monitor, and that allows it to not only output strong brightness, but also output good saturation at the same time. You might think that doesn't really matter for this kind of element because it's just white, what does it matter? But it has a bit of a rim of orange and then orangey red, and on WOLEDs there's just a very strong white core, and then there's sort of more saturated orange and red rings without any brightness to them whatsoever, and it just looks like a weird posterization effect. Whereas on this QD OLED, you get quite a nice white core, but then it has a nice warm white around it, and then yellow, and then orange. It's all smoothly blended together because you get the saturation and brightness at the same time. In other words, the colour volume is much better. TFT Central has a very interesting article on this if you're interested, by the way, all about colour volume on OLED monitors, but it is something I've picked up on and mentioned in my reviews in the past, just subjectively. So remember that when I'm talking about brightness, in this case, the monitor can show good saturation at the same time. I'm on another scene on Shadow of the Tomb Raider. I wasn't even intending to go on this scene. I loaded the wrong thing, but I use this in the contrast section, so I'll just briefly talk about it. You can't appreciate this in the video, but there are some really nice, subtle, very dark details, these little skulls and bones for these sort of outer areas here. And the monitor displays that very well, so there's a really beautiful nuanced shade variety, and the depth of the dark shades is exceptional, actually much better than it was under SDR, but that can depend on the content rather than just being an SDR versus HDR thing. But either way, the 10-bit color reproduction and the per pixel illumination really does show this scene in a beautiful way, which unfortunately you can't appreciate in the video. And at the same time, really nice brightness in the center there. And there's no haloing or anything like that, so there's an immediate transition between the brightness there and the dark shadowy area on Lara's shoulder there. Immediate transition, no haloing or blooming as you would get with mini LED solutions. This scene is one which is often shown particularly well on OLEDs, but especially QD OLEDs. And the reason I say especially QD OLEDs is again because of the color volume issue I was talking about before with WOLEDs. And that's because this is not just pure white again, it's actually has a sort of silvery white rim around it, sort of a bluish silvery purple. And the QD OLED is able to show that with a nice natural bright quality, and it's all nicely blended together rather than just having a pure white core and then more saturated but very dim kind of outer component. So it all looks much more natural on the QD OLEDs like that, shown very nicely, and the brightness levels are really nice here. It's able to pump out nice luminance levels. I can't tell you exactly what they are because this is extremely difficult to measure with a colorimeter. I mean, I did seem to get some very brief flashes of what appeared to be quite close to the peak of the monitor, a little bit below that, but again, it's very difficult to accurately measure because it's smaller than the colorimeter sensor area, and also it's shifting around all over the place and shimmering, but very nicely displayed anyway. And again, the medium to dark shades, beautiful variety there, really nice shadow detail. This is shown in a much more impressive way than I would see on mini LED solutions, for example. So the overall scene shown very nicely here indeed. This scene here is one that mini LEDs will struggle with a bit because there are some very small bright elements, like the little bulbs to my left there and in the background, surrounded by much darker shades. So the level of precision you get with mini LEDs, certainly the ones I've tested, it's just not where it needs to be to show these properly. There'll also be sort of flickering or shifts with mini LED solutions, especially for the bulbs towards the top left there. They'll show sort of halos around the embers as well as they fall down to the sky because of the lack of precision. But with the per pixel illumination, you have no such issues here. And also being QD OLED, the blue lights in the background there are shown with nice saturation as well as nice brightness. So it's really able to show these little bright elements in a really nice way. And it's able to keep the much darker shades as they should be, much darker at the same time. I'm just on Cyberpunk 2077, just taking a quick visit to this so I could talk a little bit more about the ABL, automatic brightness limiter behavior, because you'll recall from the graph that that was certainly an issue as brighter shades dominate. When you're looking at the scene now, or when I look at the scene now, most of the shades on the screen are sort of dark to medium, a few interspersed brighter elements, and QD OLEDs like this, yes, they're able to show them nicely, and the HUD elements there are appropriately bright really. But if I move the scene so that there is more sky visible, the ABL kicks in more heavily. You'll probably be able to see a shift with the HUD elements, because the ABL doesn't just mean that it's limiting the brightness of the bright shades, it means that it's dragging down the brightness of the entire scene, so that includes the medium shades as well. So you can probably see the shift in the HUD. That's not just the camera playing tricks, that is actually something I can observe to the eye as well, and that is the ABL kicking in or reducing, kicking in, reducing, just based on the sort of average picture level of the scene. And also here, if I look at the sun towards the top, really nice and bright, whereas here it doesn't have such brightness. So it's not exactly dim, but it just doesn't have the same kind of eye-catching pop that it has when it's shown like that. So I just wanted to use this scene to explain that when I was sort of, well, not criticising mini LEDs, but saying that OLED certainly is superior to them in the other scenes I showed you, well, there are scenes like this where mini LED solutions can actually do better because of their ability to maintain strong brightness here rather than just here. I'm on another scene, this one on Battlefield 5, and I like this scene because on mini LED solutions, they can really shine, quite literally, whereas on OLEDs like this, the ABL again kicks in and limits the capabilities. So the bright sun there, I recorded that at around 350 nits. It does depend on what the scene's doing though. It goes a bit brighter sometimes it's even a bit dimmer. It just depends on how much bright shade is visible on the screen at once. But the main makeup of this scene most of the time, it's really a mixture of bright and dark shades, but there are a sufficient amount of bright shade on the screen to cause the ABL to kick in fairly aggressively. So the silver lining around the cloud is a bit subdued and the sky in general isn't as bright as it should be. The glint of light on the ice there as well, not as eye-catching as it should be, and just the sun, it's not as bright as it should be. So it just doesn't have the kind of natural bright daylight quality that it could have. It doesn't look dim and it doesn't look flooded either, like some monitors would show under HDR. It's just more limited than it could be. And I'm going to shift attention to Dolby Vision. The vast majority of content you consume, especially for games, is HDR10. And HDR10 is pretty much always a supported format. For such content, Dolby Vision should be left off on the monitor. Otherwise it can upset the image balance and display things inaccurately. When observing HDR10 content, as I am now, this game is only HDR10 and I'm running in HDR10, you can activate Dolby Vision. That is to say, you can activate the setting in the monitor. It doesn't actually use Dolby Vision. It's just another sort of HDR preset really, or a set of presets. You'll see it says in the corner there, Dolby Vision, but I can assure you it isn't because this game does not support Dolby Vision. So I'm using the dark setting at the moment. Really it's more in line with the HDR settings other than HDR Peak 1000 that I was using before. And it appears limited to a similar brightness of around 450 nits. I find it a bit limited in terms of the brightness for some scenes, and it didn't have the sort of pop I personally like from an HDR experience, though it's relatively consistent due to the low ABL behaviour, just like with the True Black 400 setting. Bright, well that is indeed brighter. And game, well game seems exactly the same as bright. These are sort of more akin to the HDR Peak 1000 setting, but the calibration is far wonkier. Now remember, I'm talking about HDR10 content here, I'm not talking about Dolby Vision content, just for HDR10 content. So many medium and some darker shades are over-brightened and the overall appearance is flatter and less varied than it should be. Some bright elements are also dimmer than intended. For example, this street lamp that sits around 530 nits, whereas using HDR Peak 1000 it sits closer to 900 nits. It also appears as a giant white ball, just like it appears in the video, without the actual bulb visible. If you use HDR calibration in the game or in Windows, it will show that a 10% window is calibrated to around 500 nits. And with that, the bulb is visible, not as distinct as it was before, but it's more visible, so the sort of crushing of the bright shades is reduced. But even then, there's some noticeable over-brightening of shades, even here, and just more generally. So the shed here is a good example of this, actually. Some shades here are actually about twice as bright as they should be. Whichever way you look at it, the PQ curve is just off when you're using the Dolby Vision setting, but you're actually viewing HDR10 content. It is very difficult to show you this in the video, I'm afraid, but by eye it is very clear. This all looks elevated and flooded, which it certainly shouldn't, and it doesn't under HDR10. Actual Dolby Vision content, it is a different story. So to use Dolby Vision on Windows, you'll need the Dolby Vision app, which is a free download. There's a Microsoft App Store link where you can download it in the description of the video. I couldn't actually find this when I was searching the App Store for Dolby Vision, and after clicking the link to download it, so that's this download link here, I somehow had this maximized. I don't even know how you do it. It doesn't seem to do it anymore. But anyway, this was maximized and I couldn't see any link to download it, so I was a bit confused. But if you make sure you keep this window small, which is the default position, so there's this little thing here, there should be a little download button. I think it just says get or something like that here. So you just click that, you can get this Dolby Vision extensions plugin. And it'll just run in the background. It will basically allow you to run Dolby Vision content, and the monitor can use its Dolby Vision mode properly. So what Dolby Vision does, it allows dynamic metadata to be used with suitable adjustments made for very specific scenes or frames of the content. So this contrasts with HDR10, which uses static metadata or more general adjustments, which just apply to the game as a whole, for example. Additionally, 12-bit color processing can be used to help the monitor use that metadata more precisely, so a bit of a bump from 10 bits. The format itself is quite strict with its requirements, including at least 99% DCI-P3 coverage, a 1000 nit plus peak brightness, and contrast ratio of at least 200,000 to 1. So this monitor does actually satisfy all of those requirements. The enhanced precision of this format allows game developers to bring specific scenes and elements in the content to life in a more tailored way, and it can potentially improve aspects such as shadow detail, bright shade distinctions, and gradient handling. This all seems very good on paper, of course, but it's up to the developer to implement it well, and it's only supported at all in a small minority of PC game titles at the moment, with those titles also supporting HDR10 as an alternative format which all HDR monitors support. It's more widely supported on movie content, including using the Netflix app on the PC, where I observed some content using the setting. As with games, some movie content will have a better Dolby Vision implementation than others. For copyright reasons, I'm afraid I'm not going to be showing you the actual content, though the differences between HDR10 and Dolby Vision would be very difficult to see in the video anyway. I still want to share some brief impressions I had using Dolby Vision though. I didn't notice any difference between the bright, dark or game settings, unlike when I was observing HDR10, where the dark and the bright or game settings were very different, or at least the dark setting was different to bright/game. And I settled with bright anyway, because I like the name, and in case it did make a difference, it would be presumably the brightest setting. But the difference didn't seem dramatic compared to HDR10 anyway, but it did seem to be more contrasty in some scenes, with some very impressive dark to medium shade distinctions, and certain bright elements appearing to pop more than under HDR10. So why am I showing you the Night Agent website? Well, it's just because I thought that this title showcased Dolby Vision pretty well, and I certainly did think it enhanced the experience compared to HDR10. So it's a Sony Pictures production, and as the name implies, there are certainly some good night scenes in it, and that allows the screen to pump out its brightness without excessive hindrance from its ABL. There was a certain scene set in the night where there was a search ongoing, and there were lots of small flashing lights from emergency vehicles, and there was also a helicopter with a searchlight. And all of these lights had noticeably more pop under Dolby Vision than HDR10, and actually it appeared more like you might expect such elements to appear in a game. So that helicopter searchlight I was talking about, well, under HDR10 I recorded that at 350 nits, whereas with Dolby Vision I recorded it at 590 nits. So not quite twice as bright, but significantly brighter, and I did notice this by eye before I took any measurements. So yeah, I mean, the same sort of observations, they were made in various other scenes and indeed other titles, and I can't recall the name of the title, but there was a certain restaurant scene in another title where the candles were simply brighter under Dolby Vision, and at the same time there were subtle dark distinctions that were just more impressive. So the whole scene just looked a bit more natural, really, and more believable. I mean, it's difficult to assess gradients as they're already at a smooth level under HDR10 anyway, and streamed content isn't exactly the best way of assessing this, as it is compressed rather heavily. So really I consider Dolby Vision a nice bonus, particularly for movies where the brightness peaks can be used more appropriately. Outside of that, the differences are probably going to be more nuanced, but either way, it's a nice option to have, and hopefully support for the format will also expand in the PC gaming space, and perhaps as more monitors support it, that will happen. So back to some gameplay now. I'm using the HDR Peak 1000 setting, by the way, running the game with HDR 10, and I'm going to talk about the colour reproduction because that's another important aspect of HDR. So if you recall, this monitor's colour gamut, which is 99% DCI-P3, and there's some extension beyond that, so decent encroachment towards Rec 2020. So under HDR, unlike under SDR, the game developers can target wider colour spaces such as DCI-P3 and ultimately Rec 2020. So this monitor doesn't fully cover Rec 2020, but as I mentioned, decent encroachment onto that space. So there's a good level of vibrancy overall. Some of the greens here appear with nice pop, and so does the sky, but the wide gamuts can be targeted more appropriately now. So that means you don't get the kind of oversaturation you get where you're basically having an sRGB target but a massively expanded colour gamut which isn't neatly used. Instead, you're having appropriate use of the colour spaces supported by the monitor. You just get more selective saturation where the developers might want it to be. The flowers here are also nice and eye-catching, the blue flowers. So yes, there are plenty of lush and vibrant and eye-catching shades, but things that should be more toned down are more toned down. That includes Laura's skin as well. Under SDR, that appears with too much of a red push, and some of the brickwork there as well, it appears reddish orange, and some of it can appear a bit of a reddish brown or an orangey brown, whereas here it appears more neutral and more as it should look. I did also mention the colour volume before, so unlike WOLEDs, you don't have dilution because of an unfiltered white subpixel. So it's not really such a factor in this scene. I mean, to some extent with the fire here because it's bright and there are some nice bright oranges, but there are some scenes in this game with flowing lava and that kind of thing where you can see the gamut put to good use but also the brightness at the same time. So that's nice to see. And really the overall representation is good in the colour department because it doesn't look overdone in terms of saturation, and it looks very far from washed out. So they've put the gamut to good use and the colour capabilities of the monitor to good use. So overall, I did like the HDR experience on this. I found that it was quite similar really to my AW3425QF, which is a very nicely calibrated under HDR, and the panel capabilities are similar. So you would expect it to be similar, but I'm glad to see that Dell didn't mess anything up with the calibration, which could have upset the image. And you've got the Dolby Vision support as well, which the older model didn't have. I'm now on Battlefield 5 and I'm going to talk about the responsiveness of the monitor. This monitor has a 240Hz refresh rate. That brings with it some key advantages compared to a lower refresh rate. So this high frame rate, high refresh rate combination, I've got the game running at 240 frames a second. You can see that in the top right, a tiny little green number, probably difficult to see actually, but that means I'm making the most out of the monitor's refresh rate. So the advantages, it improves the connected feel. That describes the fluidity and the precision you feel when you're interacting with the game world. So there's up to 4 times as much visual information presented as a 60Hz monitor, or this monitor running at 60Hz or 60 frames a second. This connected feel is also aided by low input lag. I measured 0.81 milliseconds of input lag in this case, so that's an exceptionally low input lag level, and this isn't something which even sensitive users have to worry about. The other advantage of the high frame rate, high refresh rate combination is that it greatly reduces the perceived blur due to eye movement. So perceived blur is a concept explored in an article all about responsiveness on the website. But basically it's contributed to by 2 main sources, and one of them is the movement of your eyes as you track motion on the screen, and that's closely linked to the refresh rate of the display, assuming that the frame rate is also keeping up. The other aspect is pixel responsiveness. There's a photography method called pursuit photography, which is explored in that article as well. This uses a moving rather than static camera to record motion in a way that reflects both elements of perceived blur nicely. So here are some pursuit photographs on the screen. The monitor's running at various different refresh rates, 60Hz, 120Hz and 240Hz. Because this is an OLED, there is no overdrive setting to consider. A reference screen is also included in the final column. That is a fast IPS 240Hz model, the RCA Evolution Premium. So you can see the impact of the increased refresh rate in terms of improving the overall clarity of the object. By 240Hz, you can actually count the little white notches on the UFO on the 240Hz OLED, and if you look at the internal details in general, they are clearer compared to the reference screen. The OLED is also free from weaknesses in pixel responsiveness, which would cause trailing behind the UFO or any visible overshoot, whereas the reference screen does have a little bit of trailing in places and a little bit of overshoot elsewhere. So to look at this numerically, this is using the OSRTT Pro tool. It's the same tool and also the same methodology that TFT Central uses in their reviews. Be wary of cross-comparing response time data from different reviews because various different methodologies can be used by different reviewers, but you can cross-compare our results with TFT Central's. There's something to point out is that some of these readings, you can see the ones in the first column there, they seem to approach nearly 3 milliseconds. These are what you might call phantom readings or erroneous readings. The reason for these outliers, it's basically because OLED monitors like this, they dim using high frequency, low amplitude oscillation, and the OSRTT Pro tool can pick that up and it can throw off some of these readings. But looking beyond that, you can see anyway a lot of green on this and extremely fast overall pixel responses. The average initial time is the important one to look at because the initial times are what are being measured in the table, and that's 0.83 milliseconds, which is very impressive. And this is all achieved without visible overshoot. And just for completeness, some results at 120Hz. Again, be aware of outliers. That 7 for overshoot could be a phantom reading as well. I did a few repeats and sometimes it was quite a bit lower than this. I think it, again, is just the sensitivity of the sensor to the backlight dimming method used by OLEDs. But either way, very strong performance here anyway. And 60Hz, more of the same. Very strong performance, absolutely no weaknesses that you need to worry about in terms of pixel responses. So what this means in the game, or in games in general, that your experience is not impeded in any way by the pixel responses of the monitor. There are no visible weaknesses, visually instantaneous pixel responses without any overshoot. So even fine details, so if you think of those little white notches on the UFO, on a 240Hz LCD, even a fast one, they'll tend to blend together and you won't be able to count them. That's just because the pixel responses aren't quite optimal, whereas they are on this OLED. So that would translate to little details like the cracks and other texture details on the wall surface here. This is a mixture of shades, some dark and medium shades. So there's just some extra clarity compared to what you get on your typical 240Hz LCD. So this doesn't mean that you don't see any perceived blur because this is a sample and hold monitor. It doesn't have a strobe backlight or pixel strobing mode or anything like that. So you're still bound by the sample and hold limitations and the 240Hz refresh rate. But overall, the visual fluidity is exceptional for 240Hz sample and hold monitor. And that kind of level of visual fluidity is excellent. I find it really good for sort of competitive play myself. I'm on another scene on Battlefield 5, and this one has a lot of high contrast transitions, so there are a lot of much darker shades and brighter shades mixed together. This exposes weaknesses on LCDs very nicely, even fast LCDs. They'll typically have some weaknesses here because some pixel responses are quite a bit below optimal levels, certainly for 240Hz, which is quite a demanding refresh rate. But here, there are no such weaknesses at all. Absolutely visually flawless experience here. So very nice to see. The monitor also supports VRR, variable refresh rate technologies. You can use HDMI 2.1 VRR, which doesn't rely on adaptive sync, so you could use that on the PS5, for example. And also if you're using HDMI 2.1 on a PC with an NVIDIA GPU, you could use that. And the monitor also does support adaptive sync, so you can use NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode via DisplayPort, and you can also use AMD FreeSync via DisplayPort, or indeed HDMI. So lots of opportunities for VRR here. It works as you'd expect, to get rid of tearing and stuttering from frame and refresh rate mismatches. So I've got the game running at 120 frames a second now. The monitor is running at 120Hz to keep pace with that. And just as a general point, the coming down from 240Hz to 120, I do notice a difference in connected feel. It isn't as good. It's not terrible because 120Hz is not a horrible refresh rate or anything. It is half of 240Hz, and you do notice it when you come down, or I certainly do. And also there's an increase in perceived blur due to eye movement. But again, there are no weaknesses from the monitor, there's no overshoot, nothing like that to worry about. Got the game running at 60 frames a second, the monitor's running at 60Hz, and the technology works all the same. The claimed range of operation is 48 to 240Hz for VRR, but as usual, I tend to find it activates a little bit higher than that, around 55Hz usually, at least on my NVIDIA RTX 3090, that's what I observed. Not specific to this model, it's something I often observe. But either way, LFC, low frame rate compensation, is used, which means that if the game was running at 40 frames a second, for example, the monitor won't be running at 40 Hz, but it can be running at 80 Hz, so it sticks to a multiple of the frame rate with its refresh rate. That also keeps tearing and stuttering at bay. But so far I've really discussed stable frame rate environments. I've been looking at 120, 240, 60 frames a second with great stability. In practice, when you're gaming, you're not going to have such a nice controlled environment a lot of the time. You can expect some fluctuations in frame rate, which when you're using VRR translate to fluctuations in refresh rate. This is where I talk about good old VRR flickering. Now, you will be able to see some what appear to be horizontal bands of flickering in the video. That's something that the camera picks up on, but your eyes don't actually see that. However, your eyes do see these darker shades and medium dark shades flickering as the refresh rate changes. So you can see the refresh rate is fluctuating all over the place very violently, which is why this test is really good for showing VRR flicker. If you're in-game, you'd be pretty unlucky to see this kind of fluctuation, but you don't require this level of fluctuation to see VRR flickering on this monitor. It might just be a sudden change in, say, 20 Hz or so, 20 frames a second. That can trigger VRR flickering as well. But remember, to the eye, you don't really see it for these bright to medium shades. It's for the medium to dark shades where you can see it. It's a bit of a curious one. It's caused by some gamma changes which occur in these variable refresh rate environments on OLEDs. This VRR flickering is something which you observe on VA LCDs commonly as well, and on those it's typically a lot worse than this. On some VA LCDs I actually find it so bothersome that I will disable VRR, or I'll be reluctant to use it because it really distracts me. Whereas on OLEDs like this, I don't find it so bothersome, but it is quite scene dependent, game dependent, depends on your system and your own sensitivity to the flickering as well. As a general point, I don't find QD OLEDs like this have as obnoxious VRR flickering as WOLEDs. I don't know exactly why that is. It's just something I've observed with the testing I've done on monitors. So I don't find this to be the worst OLED VRR flickering, but it is definitely there, and I don't want to downplay it because I know some people are still going to be sensitive to it. To wrap up then, the overall size of the monitor, the resolution, works very nicely for an immersive experience whilst capturing what I like from a 4K UHD experience. That is a nice high pixel density. The curve of the screen, I didn't find it to be obnoxious or bothersome. After a few weeks using the monitor, I didn't really think much about the curve at all, to be honest, even when I'm on the desktop. I know some people will prefer geometric perfection and a flat screen. And when I was gaming and watching movies, I felt it drew me in just a little bit, but it's really quite a subtle curve, so it didn't have a major effect in that respect. Being an OLED, you do have to be aware of the risk of permanent burn-in and image retention as more of a minor concern really, because it's not a permanent thing necessarily. As I only use this monitor for a few weeks, so I do for the period of the review, I can't really comment on burn-in. I didn't experience any burn-in, but I wouldn't expect to over such a short period of time. Dell does include a 3-year warranty, which includes burn-in cover, just for a bit of peace of mind. So with this in mind, you don't want to use OLEDs like this extensively for productivity, but you can use it for a bit of productivity. I certainly wouldn't be scared of a bit of productivity on the monitor. And with that in mind, I was happy to see great improvements to the fringing, or lack of fringing in this case, because of the improved subpixel layout and also the excellent pixel density. It's very much going to be a non-issue for the vast majority of people now. The contrast performance, exceptional as you'd expect from an OLED. Being QD OLED, it had the usual sort of screen surface issues in terms of lighting up and taking on some colourful tints if the room was quite bright, and certainly if you have direct light striking the screen surface. But if you have at least reasonable control of your viewing environment, that can be avoided, and you benefit from the glossy nature of the screen surface in terms of the overall clarity, the direct emission of light, lack of graininess, that sort of thing. The colour reproduction was impressive in terms of the consistency and the viewing angle performance. If you're looking at it off angle, exceptional consistency, so a given shade is displayed in much the same way all throughout the screen. Now, I didn't really talk in the review about DSE, dirty screen effect, which can be an issue on OLEDs and also VA LCDs quite commonly. And that's because it wasn't actually an issue on my unit, or with this panel in general, perhaps it's not such an issue. I didn't really notice it, which is why I sort of forgot to mention it, but I did specifically test certain shades which might show it, and really I got the most minor striations I've seen on an OLED pretty much, and nothing that stood out, which is why I didn't think to mention it. So that was really nice to see. So really in all respects the consistency was really very good. It also has a generous colour gamut, so that's good for creative purposes if you want to use the extended colour spaces. It's also good in terms of presenting things in a strongly saturated and vibrant way if you like that kind of thing. And indeed for HDR, it is attractive because the monitor has pretty good Rec 2020 coverage and certainly excellent DCI-P3 coverage. The monitor put its gamut to very good use under HDR, per pixel illumination put to good use, and it was able to output nice peaks of brightness, which were really in line with what I've seen on other QD OLEDs. It really did provide a very nice dynamic HDR experience. As usual for OLEDs, ABL, automatic brightness limiter behavior, is in play, which means that it can't sustain these high brightness levels where bright shades dominate under HDR. There was also a bit of an ABL behavior in SDR. I didn't find it to be an aggressive or bothersome ABL, as I mentioned earlier in the review, but it does mean that you can't really consider this a true 250 nit SDR experience. It'll still be adequate for most people because most people are going to be perfectly happy setting their monitor between 100 and 200 nits. And with OLEDs, I generally find that the perceived brightness is a bit higher, perhaps because of the excellent consistency, and in this case because of the glossy screen surface. It can just improve the perceived contrast and brightness a little bit, I find. So you can probably get away with slightly lower brightness than you would on an LCD as well. But if you're someone who does like particularly high SDR brightness, then OLEDs like this, perhaps they're not the best choice. Another area of real strength for OLED is pixel responsiveness. No issues at all to be perceived in that respect on this one, and a really solid 240Hz experience, super low input lag. VRR worked nicely as well over both HDMI 2.1 and DisplayPort. There was VRR flickering. This is something I always observe to various extents on OLEDs. This one I would say is pretty typical for QD OLEDs, so it's not quite as bad, I find, as WOLEDs for VRR flickering, but it's still a factor and it will still bother some people. So overall, it was really much as I was hoping it was going to be in terms of the experience. The QD OLED experience is one that I personally really like. Of course, monitors are very subjective, but there's so much to like about this monitor in my opinion, and this overall kind of QD OLED experience. I know it's not going to be for everyone. I know that some people do need to use their monitor extensively for productivity, and there will be those lingering burn-in concerns, and some people just have their own preferences, like they might like really nice bright scene HDR performance where bright shades dominate, and that isn't the kind of experience that OLED delivers. But for most people, I really do think there's so much to like about this monitor that I'm happy to recommend it. Not only am I happy to recommend it, I'm actually happy to finally replace my AW3225QF, which has served me well for a couple of years now. I'm going to be replacing that with this one. I got this on retail. I wasn't given a sample by Dell, but I was perfectly prepared to return it if I didn't like it. Turns out I do like it, and I was happy with the price I paid for it. Happy to replace my AW3423DW, because really this is like a higher resolution, higher pixel density version of that with a bit more vertical screen real estate. And just personally, I really like the experience it offers, and I did find it an upgrade over the older screen. If you really like the sound of this monitor but you're not sure about the curve, I would say again that the curve, I do find it pretty subtle, so don't be put off that too much. But of course there are other options using this panel which are flat, which may be more appealing to you, and depending on pricing in your region they may be more appealing for that reason. You may prefer the aesthetics. There may be certain features that are missing on this Dell Alienware that you like, such as KVM or USB-C functionality with good power delivery, that sort of thing. I can say that the panel itself is really capable, so I'd expect other monitors sharing this panel to also offer a nice performance. So that's really all there is to the Dell Alienware AW3225QF. In the description of the video you'll find some additional resources, as well as information about how you can support the work that we do. Be aware that liking the video, subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, they are nice ways of showing your support.